During a seance, a young man appeared before her. She couldn't believe what he was telling her. And when he had finished explaining what he wanted her to do, she quickly snatched a piece of paper and wrote a letter. Little did she know that what she wrote in that letter was about to change her life. In January 1944, on a cold winter's night near the end of World War II, a small group gathered at the Master's Temple Church of Spiritual Healing, a dark, dimly lit room above a drugstore in Portsmouth, to take part in a séance with one of the most notorious mediums alive. They'd paid a little over 12 shillings each to see her, which is around £17. As they took their seats, which creaked and groaned in the small room, a short woman came into view from the darkness. 46-year-old Helen Duncan, a Scottish woman from Callander. This is who they had come to see, the famous materialisation medium, a woman who it was believed could conjure not only spirits of the dead, but their physical manifestations, formed from the gleaming white ectoplasm that spewed from her mouth and nostrils in the glow of a dim red light. But there was 2 members of the audience that had no interest in bearing witness to Duncan's so-called gifts. Alfred rapped his fingers on his notebook. He held on his lap under the wooden table. He scanned his eyes around the dimly lit room. He saw nothing remarkable. Floral wallpaper, wooden furniture, a glowing red lamp. But then Helen completely changed. She went into a trance-like state, staring wide-eyed, straight at him. A white substance started running from her mouth. The crowd gasped excitedly, waiting to see what would happen next. But Alfred rose to his feet, and his accomplice walked straight over to arrest Helen. Alfred raised his voice.
Right. That's enough, Mrs. Duncan. You are under arrest.
But there was no response. She was still fixed in a trance-like state. Officers attempted to stop the ectoplasm issuing from Helen's mouth, but failed. People started jumping from the table and racing to leave the room. After some order had been restored, Helen was formally arrested. 2 naval officers had infiltrated the séance to take it into custody. A warrant had been issued for her arrest, and Duncan was initially charged under the Section 4 of the Vagrancy Act with conspiring to defraud the public. But the supposed deception of the public by the Scottish medium was not the main reason for this elaborate sting operation. Helen Duncan was well known to authorities and was placed under fairly close surveillance for the next 2 years on suspicion of eavesdropping on state secrets. Because, through allegedly communicating with the dead, Helen had twice correctly known 2 naval secrets. The first in 1941, when she told Brigadier Roy C. Firebrace, a high-ranking British Army officer, about the sinking of Royal Navy battlecruiser HMS Hood, once the largest warship in the world. During the Battle of Denmark Straits, the Bismarck had hit the ammo hold of HMS Hood, breaking its back and sinking the ship in 3 minutes, leaving only 3 survivors out of 1,418 men. She told him all this information before he had even received the confirmation call. And then, Helen had been approached by a ghostly apparition of a sailor who wanted Helen to let his family know how much he loved them and what happened to him. So, she had sent a letter stating that the sailor's ship, HMS Barham, had been sunk in the Mediterranean when the German U-boat U-331 torpedoed the ship, killing 861 men on board. The War Office did not officially release this fact until several months later, as they had been trying to hush up the incident. So clearly, this was information the public, including Helen, should not have known. And this had now made High Command and local authorities very nervous, meaning the real reason for the raid and her arrest was due to the official paranoia surrounding the forthcoming D-Day Normandy landings, which were planned for June the 6th, 1944, and the fear that she may reveal the date, location or other details which could result in untold loss of life, training and equipment, was too much for them to risk, as this was the largest seaborne invasion in history. After Duncan was arrested, she was transported to London and held in a cell, and brought to trial at the Old Bailey in London, where she was forced to endure a 7-day trial. The prosecution had tried to charge her first with vagrancy, and when that didn't work, she was charged with conspiracy, and when that failed, she was charged under Section 4 of the 1735 Witchcraft Act, attempting to bring out the appearances of the spirits of a deceased person. To critics, it seemed this was heavy-handed and a rather desperate behaviour on the part of the state. And by now the trial had caused media sensation and was extensively covered by the newspapers, many of which revelled in printing cartoons of witches on broomsticks. But there was many people who were up in arms over Helen's treatment, and money was raised for her defence fund. But in a rare case of cross-border cooperation, both law societies of England and Scotland jointly and simultaneously declared this case to be a travesty of justice, and it is said covered this case for a reduced cost or for free. During the trial, the defence had decided the best way forward was to test Helen's gifts live in the courtroom and give a demonstration of her physical phenomena whilst in a trance in the witness box, in England's highest criminal court, performing a live séance. The prosecution took a while to decide on this request, because if Helen pulled it off, then instead of silencing Helen, which seemed paramount at this point, her case would be spread throughout Britain and possibly the world, in which would make the famed British legal system, which had also been adopted by many former colonies, open to ridicule. The best legal minds held a meeting throughout the night to decide a way forward with the case. By morning, the prosecution rejected the defence offer, and instead of a live séance, Helen would be called to the stand as a witness, giving the prosecutors an opportunity to cross-examine Helen and probably pick her apart and destroy her credibility. But Helen's defence lawyers saw through this ploy and stated Helen couldn't testify. She was always in a trance-like state throughout these séances. She couldn't possibly discuss what had happened or what had indeed been said. But at the end of the trial, the jury was asked to leave and make a decision. It took them only 30 minutes to make this decision. Helen Duncan was found guilty of conspiracy to contravene the ancient 1735 Witchcraft Act. The judge then declared the verdict had not been concerned whether manifestations of spirits was possible, as this court has nothing whatsoever to do with such an abstract question. However, he interpreted the jury's findings to mean that Helen Duncan had been involved in plain dishonesty, and for this reason, she was sentenced to 9 months in prison. Helen collapsed in the dock, moaning,
"Oh, I have done nothing. I have never done anything. Is there a God?
and
I never heed so many lies in my life."
Helen was even denied the right to appeal to the House of Lords. She was sent to Holloway Prison in London, where she only served 6 months. It is also said the wardens refused to lock the door to her cell, as they didn't agree with her charge, and she would do readings and contact the dead for prisoners and prison guards alike during her incarceration. Helen Duncan was released from prison on the 22nd of September 1944. However, The harassment she faced appears to have continued right up until her death. In November 1956, the police again raided a private séance in Nottingham in an attempt to prove her as a fraud. Once again, the investigators failed in their objectives. But 5 weeks later, the woman, who will always be remembered as the last witch, died. Interestingly, more than 40 witnesses gave evidence in support of Duncan, all claiming she had genuine powers. Some said they'd watched her materialise spirits, which spoke Spanish, recited nursery rhymes, touched and kissed members of the audience. One witness, called Fred Swaffer, took to the stand to assert the integrity of her ectoplasm, which he claimed poured out of her like living snow. Nevertheless, the Crown prosecutor argued that Duncan was a fraud, and that she was an unmitigated humbug, who could only be regarded as a pest to a certain section of society. But not everyone felt this way or was happy about the trial. Winston Churchill wrote to the Home Secretary, Herbert Morrison, scorning him over the waste of money on Duncan's trial, branding it an absolute tomfoolery. Mrs. Duncan was the Scottish wife of a disabled World War I veteran, Henry Duncan, a man who was now an unemployed cabinet maker, but who was also a committed spiritualist. Helen Duncan was also a mother of 6 children, and money was naturally tight for the family. She had already shown an interest in reading tea leaves and earning a few pennies from making predictions. Her husband encouraged her to hold seances and charge attendees. She eventually became a travelling medium, where she became very popular. In the aftermath of the horrors of the Great War, there was no shortage of people in Britain who were only too willing to pay to communicate with their lost loved ones who had passed over. Spiritualism was a booming industry in the 1920s and 1930s. Quite often, families had only been given a brief War Office telegram about a fallen soldier. So, with no other information and the fact the family could not travel to France or Belgium to mourn, see a body, or a grave, denied a family of proper acceptance and the opportunity to grieve. Numerous widows and grieving mothers thus attended seances and sought out spiritual healers or clairvoyants. Some people were adamant that Helen contacting the dead was a kind act, helping those grieving to have the closure they needed. With so many people flocking to Helen, it was even rumoured George VI and Winston Churchill were her clients. Skeptics, however, insisted that Helen was preying on the bereaved for profit, targeting those whose loved ones had either been killed or were missing in action. Duncan is constantly referred to as the last convicted witch, but in reality there was one more, Jane Rebecca York, an East London medium who was found guilty on 7 counts against the Witchcraft Act at the same year and fined £5 for it. But the act was eventually repealed in 1951, a decision heavily influenced by the publicity of Duncan's trial. In 2008, the Scottish Parliament rejected a petition to pardon Helen. Graham Hewitt, who is still fighting the case on behalf of her grandchildren, said, "She was tried under an old piece of legislation that shouldn't have been used at the time, and advice had been issued by the Director of Public Prosecutions that alternatives were available." The attention that Duncan's trial garnered made it evident to the public that this Witchcraft Act had to be removed. It was repealed and replaced by the Fraudulent Medium Act of 1951, which prohibited anyone from claiming to be a medium in order to deceive others to make money, rather than just for entertainment. This in turn was repealed in 2008. Well, that'll about do it, but please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I think there was some over-exaggerating and some showmanship going on, but not including the correct knowledge of the sunk vessels. There was many accounts of the seances that she got right. I do feel it seems like this is a desperate attempt to silence her by the state for a few months while they got the D-Day landings out of the way, as she was punished far more severely than anyone else arrested for the same crime. It also irks me a little that this backwards law was still around. I mean, the whole witch trials was a complete nonsense, where many people, mostly women, were tortured and put to death because of false claims, simply because of greed, jealousy, or because of something that they couldn't understand. I hope you enjoyed this story. If so, check out my growing collection on my channel. Thanks for your support. Take care.